Okay, friends, welcome on behalf of the Association for Iranica in Australasia. I have the great pleasure to welcome you all to this gathering. Um, and this is one of our fifth, perhaps, lecture in 2024 lecture series, which we're having. And before I start, I would like to acknowledge the custodian and uh, tribal and also the indigenous cultures of Australasia and also global, because it applies to all the regions that we are and we living. And Therefore, the cultural diversity of all these regions is quite fascinating, and it also relates to the topics of our today's discussion. Anyway, before anything else, I'll just say a few words about our association. The Association of Iranica in Australasia was formed in about 2004 in Sydney, and our activities were mostly in form of symposiums and conferences and forums that we held at various venues, at universities and also art galleries and libraries. And then the COVID came, and as a result, we had this disruption of communication or face-to-face approach. So therefore, we went virtual, and we had various projects with the Australian National University. We held highly successful virtual conferences, and it had audiences and participants from all over the world, including Iran. We had presentations virtually from all parts of Iran that they participated. Now, we have continued these virtual lectures, and they've been proving to be successful, and we have them on the average about 6 to 7 bi-monthly, or sometimes even more. So it's progressing. So we hope that we can continue that. And on the subject today, I have a great pleasure to introduce the speaker, Dr. Farshad Sonboldel. And I'll just briefly mention about his current position, and I leave the befitting introduction to Aria John, who will be a discussant for this gathering. Farshad is the World History and Cultures Librarian at the University of California in San Diego. And of course, his book is basically he's talking about his book, and specifically about a chapter of his book, which is the main title of the book, called The Rebellion of Forms in Modern Persian Poetry. That's a brief word about our discussant, Aria. Dr. Aria Fani is he holds a PhD in Near Eastern Studies from the University of California in Berkeley. And Aria research and teaching focus on modern Persian literature and translation, and translation studies. And his first book was entitled Reading Across Borders, Afghans, Iranians, and Literary Nationalism, which was published by the University of Texas. In that book, Aria concentrates on relationship or the shared heritage of Persian literature in both Afghanistan and Iran, and some elements of cross-cultural exchanges which have taken place in the 20th century. And apart from that, Aria is also teaching Persian translation and has published various research topics, not only about Persian literature, but also his interest in cross-cultural and other world literature and translation studies. And also he's receiving funding from the Simpson Center for the Humanities to continue both his research and his studies in translation and Persian poetry. I'm sure that it was not adequate introduction, but anyway, forgive me. And I'll just pass it on to Aria John to introduce Farshad and his book. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Masudjan. I appreciate your kind introduction. I also appreciate the fact that Farshad's invitation me to serve as discussant led me to get to know your association. Yet it's another reminder of the global scale on which Persian literature continues to operate. I did not know that such an association had been around since 2004. That's 20 years. So I commend you, and I hope that you take the time to celebrate, 2 decades of this important initiative. I genuinely am very honored that my friend Farshad asked me to introduce him and to serve as a discussant. I first heard about Farshad when he was at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I learned about him because he had brought truly a great deal of energy and vision to that university, and I could see that through the exciting talks that he was organizing as part of the Iranian Studies Initiative. Also, someone for his age, he's incredibly prolific. He's as humble as he is prolific, an award-winning poet, translator, critic. In fact, the first time I read anything by him was a Persian language volume on literary criticism, trying to bridge this kind of gulf that has grown as a result of various factors, political isolation being one of them, between the what academics in Iran produce and what academics in Europe and the US produce. And that volume is a valiant effort to put trends in literary criticism in conversation across these borders. And so he's been doing really important work for quite some time. He survived the United Kingdom and walked away with a PhD from University of St. Andrews. And as Masudjan said, serves as a librarian today at the University of California, San Diego. I hope you survived San Diego too, the former city that I lived in for 7 years and almost died of boredom. I want to say a few words about his wonderful book published this year, The Rebellion of Forms in Modern Persian Poetry, Politics of Poetics Experimentation. This is truly an exciting book. And I say this for a number of reasons. For one, There's not every day that we have a book that deals with modern Persian poetry. I have my colleague Nilufar Talebi here on this meeting, and she's been a huge advocate for bringing contemporary and modern Persian poetry into engaging and bright English translation for a long time, and she's felt very alone and isolated because but we academics tend to stop at the revolution or soon after. And as Farshad reminded me yesterday when we were chatting about today, that we're almost dealing with half a century of poetic production that no one wants to claim, that scholars, myself included, we considered Furuq Farrokhzad and sometimes Sadiq Hidayat and many others as moderns, which of course they are. But you've also had so many voices that have come after them and have opened different horizons. You can then expect in the second half of this book to come all the way to the very last years of the 20th century. And Farshad, if I'm not mistaken, you gesture as well towards voices in the 21st century. And so this is number one, that he delves into work that people just have made a habit of overlooking, completely overlooking. And for that reason, he's a vital voice in our field today because he has access to these voices, he's read them, he's been in conversation with them, and we can all stand to gain so much from basically reading this book and learning from him. And number two is, unlike other studies, other classical studies of modern Persian poetry, namely, I think of my mentor's book, Recasting Persian Poetry by Dr. Karimi Haqqaq, there is no effort in this book to curate a selection of poetry that belongs to certain lineage that culminates, in Nima Yushij, who's seen as the founder of modern Persian poetry, and all of this ultimately concerns a canon, a body of work that we can call modern or modernist. Farshad is not, he's not after creating a canon or telling us what version of modernity has prevailed, what version of modernity encapsulates the essence of Persian poetry in the new age. He's actually after indexing and really showing how newness enters the world of modern Persian poetry on the level of rhetoric, on the level of lexicon, on the level of prosody, which is another important aspect of his work. Because he knows aruz or Persian prosody, and he takes that very seriously, then the question of form of poetry is also something that is taken into account. I mean, I could go on and on and on. I will save other comments for later. There are also other aspects of Farshad that I have not been able to verify. For instance, there is a claim that he knows how to make good kebabs. I have not been able to verify that. When I visited him, he did not make it. And so for that reason, I'm sorry, I have to be fair. And that aspect of it, we'll just see. I'll judge you on this when I try it. So with that, please join me in welcoming my good friend and colleague, Farshad, Dr. Farshad Sonboldel.
Thank you, Arijan, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Masujan, for organizing this event. I'm very honored to be here talking to you, good colleagues and friends, about my book. And let me just start sharing my screen so I can get into the talk that I prepared for today. Okay. Can you all see my screen now? Okay. So I'll set a reminder for myself so I don't go over time. Okay. Well, okay. I've had a couple of, more than a couple actually, I think 3 or 4 book talks after I published this volume, and in every one of these book talks, I started the talk with a very short piece of a poem that I wrote working on this research. When I started writing this book, it wasn't just a research for me. It was really asking myself some big questions about what it means to be a poet and whether my own writing matters in this in Persian poetry today, actually. I got fascinated by these amazing voices in modern Persian poetry, especially the ones that history books tend to skip over. While digging into these the story of actually these poets and bringing their works into spotlight, I found myself in a quite journey, basically a journey of my own. At the same time as working on this research, I also wrote a verse essay, a long poem called شعر بلند شرایط, or the long poem of consequences or circumstances, however you want to translate it, which was published in 2019. And I see that poem, that long poem, that verse essay, as I like to call it, a poetic representation of the ideas explored in this book. So I would like to start with the very last lines of that poem. Do you see the whole slide? Because I have things. Okay, thank you. So that verses say that long poems end with these lines. چراغ‌ها را خاموش کنید و از مجاز مرسل یادآرید. از استعاره و از تصویر شکسته تا بر گوشه صفحه بی‌معنا. به خواستگاری زنم بروم دوباره با این شعر و از آن خیمه تاریک درآیم. تمام شرایط مشروح ضمن عقد را به هجله بیاویزم. صدای قافیه ها را که می آید یا نه و بحر را تقطیع کنیم و ببینیم چه می شود آخر. من از تمام آنچه به فارسی میزنی زدم و آنچه از تمام شاعران بد فراموش کرده اید به خاطرتان می آورم و نوحه می سازم. بیا به روضة الشعرا و خالی کن، ببین که اگر من عطارم حتما سعید تایی هم هستم. Well, the evolution of Persian poetry hasn't followed a straight or predictable path. Since the 19th century, various periods have introduced numerous poets and movements, each offering distinct perspectives on literary transformation. However, many of these voices were sidelined or overshadowed by the dominant trends of their time. In every phase of modern Persian poetry, multiple poetic movements have emerged in parallel or as a counterpoint to the mainstream, engaging in intellectual and artistic exchanges that have often been left out of the conventional narrative. Mainstream scholars tend to portray the evolution of Persian literature as a steady and measured departure from traditional aesthetic frameworks, reflecting a gradual embrace of modernity in response to the socio-political changes of the mid-19th century. These accounts typically suggest that modern Persian poetry developed organically as a reaction to the shifting cultural demands of Iranian society. Yet, this perspective often overlooks or underplays the importance of alternative poets whose bold experiments with form and style were instrumental in triggering and propelling the so-called literary revolution. Ahmad Karimi Hakkak, in his celebrated work Recasting Persian Poetry, observes that the mainstream's neglect of experimental poets is not unusual. He points out that when unconventional forms of poetry first emerge, they are usually dismissed as nonsense or non-poetry because they challenge established norms and are often difficult for readers to grasp in a way their creators intended. According to Karimi Hakkak, these alternative works often fail to resonate with audiences because they defy the conventional means of producing aesthetic pleasure. This divergence from accepted norms led critics of the time to categorize these poets as cultural outliers, disregarding their contribution and excluding them from the literary conversation. This book seeks to rectify that oversight by reevaluating the pivotal role of these poets that they played in advancing modern Persian poetry and exploring their unconventional approaches to aesthetics towards the various stages of literary revolution. This research presented, the research that I presented in this book seeks to reassess modern Persian poetry's aesthetic revolution and challenge prevailing assumptions found in contemporary scholarship. In recasting Persian poetry, Karimi Hakkak discusses the transition from Ghani, a prominent 19th century literary figure, to Nima Yushij, considered as the father of modern Persian poetry. However, Karimi Hakkak's arguments are based on the dominant narrative that views mainstream modernist trends as the only natural alternative to classical Persian poetry. He suggests exploring abandoned visions and unsuccessful efforts as supplements to the mainstream. Yet, I counted against marginalizing alternative poetic movements in mainstream narratives. Instead, I argue that these movements, whether collectively or individually, run parallel to mainstream poetry, and their aesthetic experiments played a significant role in shaping literary change. In a sense, this study challenges mainstream literary histories by shedding light on the overlooked journey of alternative poems, connecting figures like Yaghma Jandaghi in the 19th century to Tondar Kya and Hushang Irani. Of course, this line can be continued even after the revolution, but that's where the book stops. In this way, the book rewrites the narrative of Persian poetry's modernization by examining how aesthetic transformations intersected with resistance to political and cultural domination. The book categorizes the history of alternative poetry into 4 key periods: the literary return movement, constitutional revolutionary poetry, post-constitutional poetry, and the dominance of modernism. By analyzing the aesthetic, cultural, and political dimensions of select poets across these periods, the book uncovers a more nuanced and multifaceted history of Persian poetry's evolution. The chapters of this book focus on the pioneering experiments of various poets and movements, highlighting how these innovations diverged from moderate reformist approaches to literary modernization. These experiments offered alternative paths for engaging with social realities and resisting cultural and political oppression through poetic form. Each chapter takes a close look at the formal characteristics of selected poems, showcasing their efforts to correct or challenge established norms in Persian poetry. By doing so, the book reveals how these early experiments influenced subsequent generations of poets and contributed to the broader transformation of Persian poetry. During the Constitutional Revolution, for example, poets employed performative elements from religious and folk traditions to amplify marginalized voices. This blending of colloquial and formal elements laid the foundation for further experimentation with genre and the form. Especially in the post-constitutional period, the focus shifted to a more radical experimentation as poets began to push beyond incorporating current events and themes into their work, venturing into innovative formal territory. The achievements of these experiments were then expanded upon by the experimentalist and avant-garde poets during the modernist period of the 1940s, 1950s, and also 1960s, reshaping the landscape of Persian poetry in total. Each section of this book begins by analyzing the specific formal innovations before delving into broader discussions about literary change and its connections to political and cultural resistance. This approach enables a evaluation of overlooked practices of alternative Persian poets over the past century and reconstructs the narrative of poetic evolution in modern Iran. Of course, there are brief biographies of some of these poets included because it basically helps to understanding the context that these experiments arose actually. By focusing on poets who have received little scholarly attention, this book challenges the conventional literary canon. Persian literary territories have traditionally concentrated on mainstream trends, leaving the experimental and avant-garde movements in the shadows. To address this gap, the book adopts a transcultural approach, situating these poets within the broader context of world literature. Rather than viewing them solely as products of local culture, their works are considered part of a global dialogue about modernism and literary experimentation. This perspective allows for a more comprehensive understanding of the innovative contributions made by these alternative poets and their significance in the history of modern Persian poetry. So just to put it in a few words, I tried to create a shadow canon, basically, by writing this book and doing this research. It doesn't mean that I tried to create an alternative canon, but it's basically a way, creating shadow canons is a way to acknowledge not the other, but parallel attempts in the process of poetic modernization and the political and poetic revolution. In particular, the book's very last section that I'm trying to focus today brings the light to the contribution of an avant-garde poet from the 1950s, Hushange Irani, who worked on the margins of literary culture, sought to dismantle long-standing traditions in Persian poetry, introducing new formal and thematic innovations. This talk places Hushange Irani at the center of this aesthetic revolution as he sought to break away from all prior conventions, turning in new forms of poetic and aesthetic expression that were radically different from anything seen before in Persian poetry. Just a quick biography of this poet. Hushange Irani was born in Hamedan in 1925. His early life was marked by academic achievements and artistic pursuits. After completing his high school educations in 1942, Irani received his bachelor's in mathematics from the University of Tehran. And in 1946, he started actually professional training in painting. In 1946, he also joined the Iranian Navy and was sent to England for training. However, he quickly realized that the military life did not suit him. So he left England for France, where he lived for a year before moving to Spain in 1950. He completed a PhD in mathematics with a thesis titled Time and Space in Indian Thought. Irani's intellectual and artistic life was deeply influenced by his time abroad, like living in France and Spain and basically working with artists, avant-garde artists mostly, in these two countries. Let me just skip a few sections. Like he returns to Tehran in the 1950s, and it actually his return coincides with the political turmoil following the 1953 coup, and as a result of that situation, he basically becomes more and more isolated, and at some point he stops basically working in any of the fields that he was active in. And finally, in the 1973, he died of throat cancer in Kuwait. Although there are myths that he didn't die at that time and it was just something that he made up, so no one could bother him. But it's just a myth. We don't know about that. So that's the official account that he died in 1973. Well, but Irani's legacy as a poet is primarily tied to his involvement in Khurus Jangi, Fighting Rooster magazine, a magazine that played a crucial role in promoting modernist art and literature in Iran. The journal was launched in 1948 by Jalil Ziapour, Ghulam Hossein Gharib, Hassan Shirvani, and Mansour Sheibani. All of them were pioneers in literature and visual arts, especially paintings. This first series of Khurus Jangi, which was published between 1949 to 1950, the main achievement of this first round of this journal was introducing modernist trends in the world art scene, especially Cubism, to Iranian readers and artists. But the journal was suspended after 5 issues because of the controversial content and suspected association with communism. Sheibani actually says that in an interview that apparently the regime thought that this Cubism that they are talking about has something to do with communism, so they mixed up the terms, and so it ended up they ended up being suspended by the government. But in 1951, some of these members left the group, and Irani joined Khurus Jangi to revive the journal, basically. That was his mission. His contribution marked a significant shift in its approach to the approach of the journal to modern art. Along with Gharib and Shirvani, Irani articulated a radical vision in a manifesto titled Salakh Bulbul, the Slaughter of the Nightingale, which was printed on the back cover of the second series of journal, every single issues. The manifesto denounced traditional art forms and called for a destruction of old artistic conventions in favor of a new, revolutionary art. The nightingale, a symbol of Persian classical poetry, was metaphorically slaughtered in this manifesto, representing the group's intent to break free from the past and embrace artistic innovation. The manifesto's 12 statements outlined a fierce opposition to tradition, calling for the rejection of both classical Persian aesthetics and moderate modernist trends. The group saw themselves as the vanguards of a new era in art, advocating for introspective creativity and freedom of expression while condemning the imitation and outdated forms. Irani and his colleagues positioned themselves against the cultural and intellectual establishment, emphasizing the need to destroy artistic idols and traditions to foster true artistic freedom. The manifesto's language was radical and aligned with other global avant-garde movements at the time, such as futurism and vorticism. Well, this might be one of the most read or heard poems of Jangi Irani. In Irani's poetry, which he began publishing in Khurus Jangi, was a manifestation of these avant-garde ideals. His first collection, Banafsh Ton bar Khakestari, Intense Purple and Gray, published in 1951, featured 13 poems and marked a radical departure from conventions of Persian poetry. The collection was notable for its use of free verse and experimental imagery, such as the poem Kabut, Indigo, which opened with the disorienting
Farshad,
sound of Himahurai and
Farshad,
Gilguli.
Farshad, just sorry to interrupt. I think we have an audience member with the mic on. If we could please have their mic off and so we can hear you uninterrupted.
Yeah, I think that. Thank you. Okay, yes, this poem actually became famous for these disorienting sounds in the beginning of. That's a first stanza of the poem. Hima hurai gil viguli nibun nibun قار کبود میدود دست به گوش و فشرده پلک و خمیده یک سر جیغی بنفش میکشد. These hallucinatory fragmented lines drew comparisons to expressionist art, particularly Edvard Munch's The Scream. The poem's abstract language and imagery were seen as a challenge to the literary establishment, and it faced widespread criticism. The phrase "scream of a continuous screaming violet," "Jigh Banafsh," was even mockingly coined by critics as a symbol of the perceived absurdity of avant-garde poetry in Iran. I think for decades, whenever a critic wanted to basically dismantle the whole career of someone, would basically call their poem a "Jigh Banafsh." It became actually it found its way in our like everyday language as well. Now, even now, when your kid is screaming and it's very disorienting, you may call it a "Jigh Banafsh." So I think that's an achievement. But Irani's second collection, Khakestari Gray, published in 1952, further explored mystical themes and marked a shift in his poetic style, while less provocative than his earlier work. The collection still contained innovative elements, such as visual poems, Unia Mystica, which is considered one of the first examples of Persian concrete poetry. This poem used the arrangement of words on the page to represent the union of a mystic soul with God, blending visual and literary art forms in a way that was unprecedented in Persian poetry, let alone the way that these sounds basically work on this page, and if performed can basically be like a sound poetry or performance poetry as well. Aya bunna aya bunna auman tintaha dijdaha miktaudan ha Humahun ha Hindu ha ha. His third and fourth collections, شعله‌ای پرده را برگرفت و ابلیس به درون آمد, A flame embraced the curtain and the iblis entered, and اکنون به تو میاندیشم, به توها میاندیشم, I think of you now, I think of all like you, both published in early 50s, continued to explore mystical and spiritual themes in these avant-garde and very unprecedented forms. Irani's engagement with mysticism, particularly through his use of Sufi symbolism and automatic writing, demonstrated his deep connection to both Persian and Eastern traditions, despite his radical break with Persian poetic norms. Just to add something very quick. This is the period of Irani's poetry that influenced poets such as Sohrab Sebehri, especially. And if you go through Sohrab's first few collections of poems, especially the first three, you can see a lot of resemblance between these poems and Sohrab's experiments. Indeed, Houshang Irani's contribution to Persian poetry was both revolutionary and controversial. His avant-garde experiments challenged the literary establishment and paved the way for future generations of poets who sought to break free from tradition. Although his work was largely dismissed during his lifetime, his influence on development of Persian modernism cannot be overstated. Irani's legacy as a slaughter of the nightingale endures, a symbol of the bold and often misunderstood path of artistic rebellion in modern Persian poetry. Well, many scholars argue that Hushang Irani's mystical indications and radical experiments with the forms of his poems led him to disengage from the socio-political dilemmas of his time. Particularly, leftist critics accused Irani of individualism, claiming that his avant-garde poetry did not engage with the language of the public or reflect the political concerns of the masses. A journal called Kabutar Sol, the Peace Pigeon, which opposed Khurus Jangi, fighting rooster, peace pigeon, helped establish the dichotomy between committed and uncommitted poets, with Iranis placed in the latter category. However, this view fails to recognize that Irani's approach to socio-political engagement was distinct from the mainstream. He resisted the conventional forms of political art endorsed by leftist activists who sought to redefine how poetry engaged with politics. Irani believed that avant-garde poetry itself, through its challenge to dominant artistic forms, constituted a political act. By breaking from traditional forms and rejecting the binary of pure and political art, he was engaging in a form of social-political resistance. According to Baband Behpour, Irani rejected both the communist approach of art and modernists who sought to preserve a connection with the past. For Irani, even Nima Yushij, widely considered as the father of modern Persian poetry, had compromised his innovations by seeking the approval of the both political activists and traditionalists. Irani expressed this critique in 1951 article where he praised Nima's contribution to Persian poetry, but condemned his later works for becoming conservative and overly accommodating to social expectations. He believed that was an article that he wrote in response to Nima's introduction on Ismail Shahudi's first collection of poetry, Nabard Akhar, if I remember correctly. Irani's critics aligns with Renato Poggioli's theory of avant-garde standardization, where rare and innovative artistic forms eventually become normalized, prompting the need for new innovations. Irani felt that Nima's later poetry, which sought public acceptance, had strangled, and he believed that true avant-garde art should not cater to societal tastes. For Irani, art existed to satisfy the artist's creative desires, free from the demands of ethics, society, or tradition. This philosophy drove Irani's radical experimentations despite resistance from both the public and literary establishment. While Irani's definition of avant-garde art as self-expression may seem narrow, one may argue that this focus on the artist's desire is only one facet of artistic creation. Irani's obsession with self-expression can be seen as a narcissistic act, arguing that an ideal reader is essential for artistic communication. Irani, however, was unwilling to tailor his work to gain public acceptance, a stance that set him apart from poets like Nima, who sought to establish their work as a part of a tradition. Peyman Vahhabzadeh interprets Irani's radicalism as a critique of the institutionalization of Nimaic modernism, calling for a revival of the original avant-garde goals of modern Persian poetry. Well, By rejecting the need for public approval, Irani risked becoming a marginalized figure within Persian literature. Ahmad Karimi Hakkak notes that this is a common risk for innovators who challenge cultural norms, as their work may be dismissed as absurd or nonsensical. The 1950s and 60s were a particularly repressive time in Iran, with both radical poets like Irani and more mainstream figures like Nima facing marginalization. Even some of Nima's more experimental poems were criticized as unwanted noise by the literary establishment. Vahabzadeh points out that modernist Persian poetry after Nima became constrained by its own success, privileging certain themes and symbols while excluding others, like the avant-garde works of Irani. Irani's exclusion from the literary mainstream has been attributed to the perception that his work was disconnected from Iranian culture. Critics like Enayat Sami'i argued that Irani failed to create an alternative to Nimaic political symbolism, and that his avant-garde techniques, such as sound poetry, automatic writing, were too foreign to be embraced by Persian literary tradition. Ismail Nuriallah also critiques Irani's disregard for classical Persian poetry, believing that Irani's radical break from tradition was the reason for his marginalization. Despite this criticism, Irani's avant-garde poetics, which combined elements of surrealism with mystical traditions, represented a significant moment in modern Persian poetry. Irani's rejection for institutionalized literary forms, both traditional and modern, placed him alongside figures like Tondar Kia as one of the leading voices of Persian avant-garde, which is basically studied and analyzed in the same chapter in this book. These poets called for the complete destruction of literary establishment and advocated for an entirely new aesthetic system. Their anarchistic and anti-hierarchical poetics functioned as a form of political resistance, challenging the socio-political and cultural norms of their time. Well, in analyzing Irani's work, I consulted Poggioli's concept of avant-garde moments: activism, antagonism, nihilism, and agonism. I don't want to go through that, but just to examine how his poetry resisted institutionalized art, I used these concepts. Irani's non-organic forms experiments with automatic writing and use of unintelligible sounds and pattern poetry were radical rejections of the dominant culture and its political group. These techniques also reflected Irani's broader critique to Persian literary tradition and his desire to liberate art form institutional constraints. The debate over whether Irani's avant-garde poetry was original or imitative also reflects a broader discussion about the relationship between Persian and Western literary traditions. Critic accused Irani of being overly influenced by Western art, failed to recognize that avant-garde artists by nature drew from diverse sources. The avant-garde movement aims to break free from institutional control over art, challenging cultural authorities who see innovation as a threat to society's value and heritage. Irani's socio-political engagement, while distinct from the mainstream, was no less impactful. His avant-garde poetry represented a form of resistance against the dominant literary and cultural system of his time. Although his work was marginalized, its influence on future generations of poets and its role in challenging the boundaries of Persian poetry remains significant. Irani's radical experimentation with form and content, along with his rejection of public acceptance, solidifies his position as a key figure in the avant-garde movement and a vital contributor to the evolution of modern Persian poetry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Farshad John. I enjoyed that presentation a great deal. Let's start with this question. Um, it's very clear that modern Persian poetry is at least according to the critics, according to institutions that preside over the canon, there's a center and then there's a periphery. So my two-part question for you is this. Um, do you agree with this assessment? And if so, uh, who uh, who are the institutions? What are the institutions in Iran that shape people's perception of the center and periphery? And number two, is that reflected in readership? Because if anybody can give us a sense of uh, the diverse readership in Iran is you, because you know about books that are published in a clandestine fashion, books, the poetry that is shared in uh, gatherings and public settings that may never be circulated officially. And so what I'm trying to say is get a sense of all the worlds in which Persian poetry, in all of its plurality, circulates.
Thank you so much for the question, Arjan. To answer the first part of your question, I think the whole process of canon formation has a long history in Persian literature in general. But in the very first years of the 20th century, before the establishment of the University of Tehran and Danishgah Adabiyat, basically as the first modern institution to study Persian literature, there were some attempts to somehow lead the process of canonization and canon formation in Iran. One of the main attempts was basically the attempts of literary journals. One of the most important ones was the most important critics at this time is Hassan Vahid Dastgerdi, who writes actually a series of articles titled Ash'ar Shu'ara Ajam Kist, who is the, I don't know how to translate it, like who is the poets of in Persian.
That was posed as an iqtirah too, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah, exactly. So he tries to give a sense of how to form a canon for Persian poetry. He basically lists a number of poets and tries to support why these poets can be considered as the greats based on their endorsement that they received from other classical poets. And he basically recommends the future academics in Iran who are willing to work on Persian literature like as like a subject, like new subject to be taught and studied in a university or like a Western institution, to create such canon, basically. So the main attempt starts there when they start basically creating this list. By creating this list, to create this list, they have a lot of criteria. One of which is with what poets and what which text basically is good to be taught from different aspects. It can be ethics, it can be the like basically the content, how it's educational, how it helps like Iranians today to be better people, and also how this content safeguards the cultural heritage and values that all Iranians share. So they started calling it as like Zough Salim, like good taste. So to safeguard this good taste, they started basically creating lists of people, poets. And it might be very strange, but I studied in the Danishgah Adabiyat, like the Faculty for Persian Literature at the University of Tehran, and the curriculum that we studied in both bachelor's and master's degree is almost the same thing that they basically used once they founded the University of Tehran. Like, so 80 years, almost no change in curriculum. And it shows that there is this force to keep this canon the same over the years and centuries, basically. And the main reason is that, and no modern poet or writer is included there. And the main reason is that the idea of canonization started with it started actually at the time that the Orientalism started, basically was the prevalent way of thinking about the cultural heritage in Iran. And this idea was established. You can see that in Nafisi's writings. And actually, Arthur Pope has this speech that is recorded, and it's very, they used to refer to it a lot, where he says that, well, you are good in crafts and beautiful things, so keep creating that and preserving that. And Europeans are good in industry and stuff. So like some kind of what to call it, like categorizing the races and nations, like you do this, we do that, and you'll be outbooked. This became some kind of a mindset for even Iranian art scholars. So they thought, if they can preserve what we already have, and let the Europeans or the others to modernize things, we can later get access to that. So they became the users of the European thought, and they had no critical perspective for that. So this process of canonization basically led into excluding whomever cannot fit in this category, the category that that is teachable, the text that is teachable in that basically faculty, in that دانشکده. So it of course influenced the readership as well, because that was the main establishment where people looked up to, to get recommendations. The endorsement of the asatid danishkade, or the faculty professors, was something really big in that time. Like to write something like an endorsement on a book, or like a poet or writer could basically lead readers to accept and to receive those works. And they basically rejected all experimental attempts at that time. So no one in the Danishkade Adabiyat could ever talk about figures like Nima, let alone Iranian. Reza Barahani actually says that in the whole 1950s, 60s, and even until the mid-70s, there was no one could even mention Nima's name in Danishkade Adabiyat. It was only the late 70s that they started, they had that event for Nima in the Danishkade Adabiyat, and Jalal Ahmad gave that speech and so forth. So even now, it's still the same case. Like as a student, I couldn't publicly announce my defense session for my master's dissertation, because the head of the faculty, chair of the faculty, thought that it might provoke some arguments in the department, and some professors might come to your session and just ruin everything. So do not, as you know, that's the customary. You put on announcement on the walls of your faculty for students and professors to come. I didn't do that. It was too much, too modern, and too avant-garde for that environment. So that's still the case. And it led basically the enthusiasts of modern poetry to seek their basically interest outside the universities. But when you do that, when you just push it out of the university, the academic way of looking at literature and analyzing it and studying it will disappear because the medium becomes newspapers and journals, so everything changes. The readership changes. The way that you present your ideas changes. It becomes simpler. It becomes less in depth, basically, because you basically spend less time on the works that you present. So it's basically a change of events. And yeah, I don't know if I answered your question actually.
Absolutely. No, absolutely you did. I'd like to ask one last question before opening it up to the audience. And this question is also related to the conservatism of academia. One major mode of innovation in modern Persian poetry, not just in your work, but virtually all scholars that work on modernism, Talattof, Qanun Parvar, Karimi Hakak, is colloquialism, is the use of colloquial language. And that is presented as this unprecedented way of connecting with ordinary readers at a time when the state has developed the political appetite to create a literate mass and ideologically transform society and create reading publics. And that is by default kind of seen as modern, that the use of colloquialism is just seen as modern. But are we not then uncritically accepting the premise that these academics have actually created in the 20th century, that Persian poetry was a phenomenon exclusively limited to elite circles or dynasties or courts, that it didn't have a social space beyond those contexts? That's one. And number two is that colloquialism was truly a phenomenon that we don't see until the Constitutional Revolution. Whereas when you read so many, poems from Mughal India, for instance, there's so many, colloquialisms in there, from Turkic words, phrases, and whatnot. And so I guess to summarize, the question is, how new is the use of colloquialism? One. And number two, do you accept the premise that Persian poetry is brought to the masses only in the 20th century, in the very emphatic, dramatic phraseology of Hamid Dabashi? It leaves the court and it arrives at the new public, the Vatan.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing up this actually. Well, the use of colloquialism in Persian poetry is not new by any means. There are a lot of texts from the very beginning of the modern Persian literature. By modern, I mean the modern language, new language, from Rudaki on, we have colloquial texts. But the thing is that the use of colloquial language to politicize a text, to somehow connect it to the masses, is considered as a result of the constitutional revolution and the birth of newspapers and press in Iran. I don't agree with that statement necessarily, because you can see the very similar, at least, use of colloquialism in the works of Yaghma Jandari, for instance, to make his work political, to criticize something about the everyday tyranny of the state and the local governors and stuff. by creating colloquial work. He basically uses the forms of nohe, like religious laments, and also ta'ziyeh, both form and language of these forms, to basically politicize his work or make it more relevant. So it's not by any means, it doesn't start at the Constitutional Revolution. But my main problem with this perspective, seeing that as a result of Constitutional Revolution and like the birth of the newspapers, is that it's too simplistic. The main historians of Persian literature claim that because of the birth of newspapers and because the society wanted that language to be able to communicate through literature, the poetry changed. So seeing poetry in that era, especially as a result of social political change, is not necessarily correct. I think that the approach is not correct. If you say it that way, how would you say if I claim that the changes in the language of Persian poetry led into the creation of modern mediums, like led into this language in Persian literature, which which made the writers and authors to communicate with masses. So you could see it from that way too. These changes in Persian poetry started in the 19th century and led into that kind of literature that was fit in these new media. So they could adopt it, basically.
I think that's a very important point.
Yeah.
Because often, and I don't know if I'm doing injustice to Benedict Anderson, you know, and his theory of imagined communities, where he basically says the creation of periodicals and fiction basically leads to these new forms, these new identities centered on nation states. But it's a little bit too deterministic. I agree with you that by virtue of these new forms, periodical, print culture more broadly, it just leads to these automatic changes, whereas you're totally right. You could look at it from the other direction as well. And there is proof that a lot of the ideas that then get baked into modern Iran in the late Qajar, early Pahlavi period, 1920s, 1930s, were there before. And so they're just finding new modes of circulation and articulation. How about some questions from our wonderful audience? I think we have 10, 12 minutes for questions, and looking forward to where this conversation goes. Letizia.
Thank you, Farshad. It was wonderful. I have your book at the very, very top of my to-read list. I'll get there soon, but it was great to have an overview of it. I've got two short questions. The first one is about the places of publications and the publishers. It's for my own interest because I'm working on publishers. Where did Ushangirani publish outside of Khorus and Jangi? Were the publishers that were interested in that kind of literature? So that's the first question. And the second is about, without going into the question of influence, Western East, influenced by each other, have you found traces of Irani's travel into France and Spain and his contact and exchanges with the surrealists, for example? Are there any archives, like letters, being exchanged between them? Because he seems to be very influenced by French surrealism, as I understand.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Well, as for publishers, during that time, they usually self-publish their works, and they publish them actually in very few copies. So Muhammad Muqaddam, Houshang Girani, and Tonder Kia are those who self-published their works, and they published in less than 100 or 150 copies usually. We know that because in some cases they noted that in the beginning of the collection, like Muhammad Muqaddam has this statement at the beginning of his collections that it's been printed in like 100 copies. That's it. So there is no publisher per se, but I assume that because Irani had access to like publishing houses because they basically published a very, very popular journal at the time. Not as a professional publisher, but he had like a team probably to help him to publish his works because he is actually Irani and also Muhammad Muqaddam, they both published like in their collections, they also printed some of their visual arts. So Irani was a painter, and I tried to show them a few of his works in my slides. So these were included in his collection. So I assume that it was more than just like a print house where they took these and like just printed out and bind them. It's more professionally created, but they self-published. There's and I don't think there were any publishers dedicated to modernist literature at the time either. So and he didn't have like a great reception, so he wasn't accepted as like a poet to be able to publish by those few publishers who publish classical literature or anything like that. As for the Irani's trip to Europe, it's basically, no, we don't have any evidence. It comes from what Sirus Tahbaz and Manouchehr Ateshi wrote on Hushang Irani's work, basically, because these two collected his works after his death in two separate works, basically. But they wrote on Irani based on like their sources were basically what they knew as they were connected with him, like in personal level. So the biography that they wrote on Irani is just based on that, like the dialogues that they had with Irani and the like the personal relationships. So there is no reference or any kind of material. The other thing is that Irani has several articles as well. And in his articles, it shows that he was familiar with these movements. And there was no other way for him to be informed of those movements, basically the ideas and theories of those movements, but being there. Because at the time, there was no translation of those works and like the medias that he could get access to, basically the publications, even to read in Iran. So whatever he knows about like surrealism, like automatic writing, and this kind of stuff should come from the time that he was there. And also studying his painting, the changes that happened to his work after his trip to Spain and France shows that he at least he has seen works of like surrealists at the time. Because it's changed his work entirely. The whole style and even materials changed.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Farshad, please go for it.
Hello, everyone. I'm sorry, I'm trying to turn this around so it's not just the sunset. But anyway, hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Farshad, for this wonderful talk.
Thank you.
And hello to Aryajan and all the other present colleagues. I really appreciate, Farshad, that you mentioned at the end that Irani was heavily criticized for sort of the inapplicability of his innovations and for taking the work so far out of, I think, general access. And that, the response, to that is that, these acts are extreme forms of social and political resistance in and of themselves. In fact, I was wondering whether you have done any research on the impact of his poetry directly into other of his contemporaries' poetry. I'm thinking perhaps, maybe Yadullah Royai's works were impacted by these innovations, perhaps Shamlu, I'm not sure. Have you done any research, or is there any actual existing research out there on the direct impact of his work on the other poets' work? And I apologize again for the sky view, and I'll take my response offline. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Niloufar Can. And well, in the conclusion chapter of the book, I tried to show how Irani has influenced Sher Digar movement, and through Sher Digar, figures like Yadullah Royai and also Ahmad Reza Ahmadi. I didn't go through this idea that much there, because the idea of the book was to cover these period, like between the the late 19th century to 1960s. So it was always an idea for me to write a second volume showing that how these impacts now works, especially after the revolution. But I see your point. I totally agree with the impact that Irani had on these groups and movements, especially on Sher Digar, because in the first and second issue of the Sher Digar journal, it was a journal, like pamphlets, and they had this introductory part where they posted poems by those who claimed were the poetic fathers of that movement. One of them is Tondarkia, another one is Husang Irani, the other one is Rumi. Also younger poets of the generation. That's very interesting. Like, I think there is a poem by Mancher Ateshi there as well. But it shows that how they see Irani as a poetic father for this kind of a movement. And later, Sher Hajm, which is basically drove from Sher Digar and the Jonge Torfe, and later Jonge Sher Digar, is very heavily influenced by that heritage, like the Irani's heritage in that movement. And as I briefly mentioned in my talk, even in poets like Sohrab Sepehri, the first half of Sohrab Sepehri's career is heavily influenced by Irani, and also Ahmad Reza Ahmadi. I have written a little in Persian about this idea, about how the works of Husang Irani, and especially Tondarkia, has continued to the next generation of poets, avant-garde poets, but not in English. I have a monograph on Tondarkia called گزارش نهیب جنبش ادبی شاهین, which published in 2015 in Tehran. That's focused on Tondarkia, but I talk about how, I talk about these poets as the avant-gardes of the 1950s and 1960s, and try to show how this leads into a bigger avant-garde movement even after the revolution. Yeah, but I totally agree, especially about Yadullah Royai.
Thank you so much for your response.
Okay. Masujun, unless you could tell us where the post talk party will be at, I think we can all thank Farshad for his wonderful presentation and look forward to your next event.
Thank you so much, Aria Can, and thank you, Masujun, for organizing this.
Thanks a lot. It's good to see you all.
Masujun, you're muted.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was looking I live in the border, Mexico, United States.
Yeah.
And I was looking in libraries and bookstores in Mexico to check contemporary Persian poetry translated to Spanish. One question is, do you know of anyone that translates to Spanish? That's my first question. And then, since I live in the border, there is a new border literature in the northern Mexico and southern United States region. Is there any border poetry, border writers, and that influenced by geographical position in Iran? That's my second question. I would love.
I think I could answer that question.
Of course,
Bueno,
yes. Yeah.
mucho gusto, Angelina. ¿Usted dónde vive?
En Tijuana. Sí,
Tijuana, bueno, bueno.
Tecate. En
Tecate,
Tecate,
sí, sí.
donde se hace la cerveza.
Ándale, pues don sí, la cerveza.
Sí.
Fíjese que ahorita yo le doy mi correo electrónico y
Ajá,
si me
sí.
manda un mensaje, le voy a enviar unas colecciones de poesía. Sí, hay personas que traducen poesía persa en México, en España, y sí, se la mando unos libros electrónicos.
Muchísimas gracias.
No, a usted por asistir.
Ajá.
Muchísimas gracias a usted. Sí,
No,
y
sí,
también hay personas que en sus obras se tratan de tema de frontera y la vida fronteriza, especialmente los kurdos en Irán, que viven entre
sí.
Irak y Irán. Sí.
Ajá. Sí, eso era lo que preguntaba, si hay una corriente geográfica, ¿no? Literaria que esté ligada a la geografía y a la mentalidad de la persona que migra de un lugar a otro,
Sí,
¿no? O sea,
sí, claro que sí.
Sí, en el norte de México estamos muy ligados, ¿no? Entonces casi vivimos
Entre
half and
México
half.
y el diablo.
Ajá, sí, entre el infierno y el paraíso, ¿no? Ajá, sí,
Sí. Bueno,
una cosa.
por favor, escríbame. Un gustazo.
Sí, ajá, sí, bueno, me inscribí con mi correo electrónico a la plática, sí, pero
A ver.
¿cuál es su correo electrónico?
Está en la plática, en el chat.
Perfecto, a ver. Déjeme ver dónde está, porque luego se me desaparece. Yo no estoy así muy versada en estas cosas. Ajá, aquí.
Leticia nos puede
Sí,
entender,
sí.
ayudando debido a su francés. ¿No, no es cierto,
Ajá.
Leticia?
Ajá. Aria
I
Fani.
don't speak Spanish, but I get a little bit of what you're saying.
I was just saying that. I
just wanted to say that I live half an hour from Tijuana, so I don't know
Aria
Spanish.
Fani.
@uw.edu. You know, Farshad,
University of.
you should go and get some Tecate beer.
Yeah, I wanted to actually say
Yes.
That beer is really good,
Yeah.
and Martijan is gonna miss out of being all the way in New
Yeah.
Zealand. We could
I live very close to the border, to the Tijuana, so
it's a wonderful,
yeah.
it's a wonderful place, Tecate.
Sure, yeah,
Oh,
that's in my
yes,
bucket
yes.
list to go there.
Yes, anytime you come, we will go to the Jardín Cerveza, the brewery garden.
I will come too. Don't go without me.
Aria Fani.
uw.edu. Oh, Nilüfer is joining too. There you go. Company is complete.
uw.edu.
Message you are muted.
Masujan, I think you're still muted. We can't hear you. We still muted.
Okay, I just wanted to thank you all for this wonderful session we had, and we learned a lot, Farshad, and also I started to read chapters of your book, but I have to really go back and read it more thoroughly and learn more about it. Just one quick advertisement for our next event would be on the 14th of November, and it would be by another Shirazi friend from from Canada, and he's a musician. That was his Rezania, and he's finishing his PhD. Basically, he's going to talk about the Persian music in the last century, which would be fascinating. and some of sharing his research on that subject. So I hope, you can participate. We'll advertise it in due course and notify everyone. Thank you all for your participation, and we look forward to be in touch again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to everybody.